Hello and welcome to this Bloomberg Green interview with Frans Timmermans and me, Jess Shankleman. Mr. Timmermans is a Dutch politician and a diplomat who's served in the European Commission since 2014. He's currently Executive Vice-President for the Green Deal, which is a package of policies designed to deliver a climate-aligned recovery from the pandemic. Before I begin, we've conducted a poll on social media asking people about the impact of the pandemic on climate action. 45% of those who responded said the pandemic has accelerated climate action, but 55% disagreed. I want to start by asking you, Mr. Timmermans, how have you seen the debate around climate change shift since 2014?
Well, first of all, many expected once the pandemic hit that the European Green Deal would take sort of the back seat. Some even said, come back in 10 years' time when we've come out of this crisis. But interestingly enough, the Green Deal became Europe's recovery strategy to get out of the COVID crisis. And I see this now happening in other parts of the world as well. So at the end of the day, the pandemic has actually led to a speeding up of measures to take us into a sustainable future rather than slowing it down.
You say that, but then many parts of the world, they haven't seen any kind of green stimulus packages at all. And in the US, we're only just starting to see that under President Joe Biden. Why has the European Union been able to move so quickly on this? I mean, a year ago, the Green Deal was just a piece of paper.
Well, first of all, I think when I launched the idea of a Green Deal in the electoral campaign, we saw a huge response to that idea. And also parties who didn't embrace that initially, such as the Conservatives, understood that this was something Europe had to deal with because Europeans wanted us to deal with it. So I think that's an important element in all of this. Secondly, over the last 20 years, we've shown that you can grow your economy. Europe's economy has grown with about 60% since then, and still reduce your emissions, because in the same time frame, the emissions decreased with more than 20%. So the basic understanding is that you can green your economy and still create growth is something we have some experience with in Europe. So I think these two elements combined led to the European Green Deal as a growth strategy, and not intending to sort of slow us down, but to give us the possibility to profit from what needs to happen anyway, which is humanity learning to live within planetary boundaries and using the opportunities the Industrial Revolution offers to a new and modern, circular, digitized economy.
I mean, it's one thing to install a few wind turbines and solar panels. Some of the areas that you're looking to tackle now are much more complicated. Can you take us through some of the areas of friction that are arising now, maybe perhaps in transport and agriculture, and how you plan to deal with those?
What we saw when we did our analysis of what needed to be done to get us to climate neutrality in 2050 and to get us to a reduction of at least 55% in 2030 is that there are three areas that are more complicated than others. One is the built environment. The other is everything pertaining to transport. And the third is agriculture. So we will have to have special attention on these three areas if we are to fulfill our pledge, which is now actually set in law to reach minus 55 in 2030. On the built environment, that means that we are also in the framework of the recovery plans, we are launching a renovation wave. Now the built environment is reducing its energy consumption with about 1% a year. That's not enough. We need to double that to at least 2% a year. To do that, you need to invest. You need to use the money that is now being mobilized to come out of the crisis to invest in refurbishing our buildings, in installing solar power, in installing heat pumps, in bringing insulation, et cetera, et cetera. And this is also a huge economic opportunity because it gets the economy going very quickly in buildings. And we also have a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises that could profit from this directly. So it leads to employment immediately as well. So that's the built environment, a huge task, but also an incredible opportunity. In transport, we will have to speed up our shift to zero-emission transport, which means more electric mobility, which means even stricter emission norms, which means installing charging infrastructure on European roads so that EVs can actually be used more freely, and which also means that we need to look at what we're doing in aviation and in shipping. So that's a huge task in the years to come. On agriculture, we have a double challenge, because there it's not just about the climate crisis, it's also about the biodiversity crisis. The threat of ecocide is imminent. We could lose 1 million species. And biodiversity is directly threatened by our use of pesticides in agriculture, by our use of fertilizers, overuse of fertilizers. So we need to change that. We need to move towards a more ecological agriculture. And that's also a very difficult shift. All this combined is a tectonic change. We're not talking about some changes in the margins. We're actually talking about reshaping our society and reshaping our economy and changing the way we behave as citizens.
There's so much I want to unpick there, but I'm going to start with what I just heard you talk there about ecocide. Now, I remember 10 years ago, campaigners calling for ecocide to be a crime in the same way that genocide is. Do you think that there could be a time when companies could be charged for ecocide, where we could see ecocide appearing in courts?
Well, I think if you are serious about humanity having to live within planetary boundaries, we need to get serious about stopping the loss of biodiversity. And already the word biodiversity to many people is a bit strange or a bit uncommon. We need to create the same sense of urgency in our society that we already have on the climate crisis for the biodiversity crisis. Then I'm sure our citizens will push our private sector, our big companies, in the right direction. Now, having said that, if it doesn't happen, I think we should take a more stricter legal action, for instance, in the European Union, when companies don't comply with already existing environmental laws. I think it is highly, highly urgent that we take that more seriously at the European level, but especially also at the national level.
And on transport, there's a number of European countries, that, including France, that are banning the sale of new internal combustion engines from mid-2030s. Do you see that becoming a European Union-wide law, or do you think it should be left up to individual countries?
Well, our approach is different. Our approach is to increase the emission norms, thus stimulating the automotive industry to move towards zero-emission transport means, which is, for cars, is probably all going to be electric, and stimulating them by providing them with the necessary physical infrastructure, which is the charging network and the underlying generation of sustainable energy. That's what we should be doing. I know that a number of member states want to ban cars at a certain point in time. That's not the approach of the European Commission. And by the way, I think developments are going so fast in this area. If I were to go back with a time machine 2 years and would tell people where we are now, they probably wouldn't believe it. Certainly the automotive industry wouldn't believe me, but they've seen the light. They have changed, all of them, and understand that that sort of playing around with the internal combustion engine is not going to solve the problem. They really need to make the shift towards electric mobility and perhaps fuel cells driven by hydrogen. And I think this is happening much faster than many had anticipated. So we have to be careful on the government side that we don't create sort of a barrier by not providing the right infrastructure for our citizens to be able to just afford electric mobility or even be able to move around adequately with electric mobility.
I understand. One of the European Union's key tools in the fight against climate change is the emissions trading system, which you're looking at expanding under the Green Deal. Do you think that there could come a point where, for example, drivers or homeowners are on the hook for buying permits?
Well, we're looking into that. We're looking into the possibility to expand the ETS also to the built environment and to transport. But I want to add that we need to make sure that the tax shift is not just about taxing emissions more. It's also about making sure that this burden is shared in an equitable way across society. Because one of the biggest threats to the European Green Deal is that the effects of our measures would be too harsh on people who have very little money to spend. And you need to correct that. If energy poverty is a direct threat to the European Green Deal. Rise in food prices, if it is not compensated by a tax shift, could be a direct threat to the European Green Deal. We should not give those people who want to undermine the Green Deal the ammunition, letting them say that this is socially unjust. We have to make sure that the Green Deal is socially just. I think this is the issue of redistribution in our society is going to be the decisive issue of the next generation. And politics is all about redistribution. What else? And redistribution in a society, global society, that needs to learn to live within planetary boundaries is one of the most complicated questions we have ever been faced with in the existence of humanity.
The question of a just transition has really come to the fore in the last year during the pandemic, because people have been seeing how unequal society is. Why is it that in the European Union, just transition only really applies to fossil fuels? Why doesn't it apply to things like agriculture as well?
Well, it does. It does apply to agriculture. If you see the reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy, they are. I grant you, it should have been more, but they are in the direction of making sure that we provide for a decent income for families who work in agriculture. And I think that there's a bigger question here as well. I think this is also the ideology that was started in the 1980s, driven by Thatcher and Reagan, has just completely run out of steam. The idea that trickle-down economics works, I mean, who still believes that? The idea that by offering tax relief to the wealthiest people, you can get everybody to live better lives, who still believes that? I think there is sort of a reappraisal of the issue of redistribution, and it comes at a time that we are faced with a climate crisis, but it's also a reappraisal of what is important in society and whether this idea that you can leave everything up to the market is still valid 100%, and especially the idea that by offering tax relief to the wealthiest people, you serve society as a whole. I think that's been proven wrong.
On taxation, another tool that the EU is looking at is this idea of carbon border adjustments. The UK has also been talking about it, and it's expected to feature in the G7 talks later this year. How feasible is it? Can you really see a future world where countries that are high polluting face taxes for countries that are low emissions for importing their goods?
Well, that's going to happen. I mean, if you say you're on board to comply with the Paris Agreement, you have to take the measures. It's not just a political declaration. You have to take the measures to get there. You have to reduce your emissions. The European Union is going to do this. Other major players, industrialized nations, will do the same. If we all move in the same direction, carbon border adjustment is not necessary. But if there is a risk of carbon leakage, that is distorting competition because others don't have to comply with stricter norms, or even companies leaving Europe to places where they don't have to abide by those norms, then I think we're absolutely justified to protect ourselves against that. And I'm absolutely sure this is in conformity with WTO rules. I also believe that working on the mechanism, showing that it can work, without having yet implemented it, could have a preemptive effect on those nations who are still pondering whether they should also move swiftly in the direction of decarbonizing their economies. It could help them, convince them to do the same, because if they do the same, we don't have to apply a carbon border adjustment mechanism.
I want to turn to a question of climate diplomacy. Obviously, there was a big summit last week at the White House. After 4 years of the US backtracking on climate change, they now seem to be back at the table. But some of the comments from leaders last week were quite sceptical. How confident is the European Union that the US is firmly back at the table and can deliver on the pledges that it's promising?
Well, I think they are back at the table firmly. I think the commitment is genuine. It's a tall order for them. Because, as I said earlier, we've been reducing our emissions for the last 20 years. They saw an increase of emissions until 2019. So it's a tall order for them. But at the same time, at state level, city level, corporate America, they've already moved in that direction, even though you'd get a different impression if you just listened to the Trump administration. So they're not starting from scratch. And I think the commitment is genuine and strong. I had another phone call with John Kerry last night, and it's clear to me that this is really, really a top priority for the Biden administration. And I'm really looking forward to working together with them. Together, I think we can also push China to go beyond what has been announced and to be very concrete also in its 5-year plans on, for instance, reducing and stopping the investments in coal-fired power generation. And peaking out their coal emissions in a couple of years' time. I think we can move ahead with that. And we see other countries also moving quite swiftly. Japan, Korea, Canada, South Africa. So there is a momentum growing internationally that might get us to net zero by the middle of the century or a little bit later. And I think the sense of urgency will only increase because across the world, citizens see what the horrible effects already are of the climate crisis as it is now, with 1 degree of increase of temperature, let alone what could happen if you have 2 or 3 or 4 degrees.
And I want to ask you as well about China. The European Union has raised concerns about human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And we've reported at Bloomberg Green that most of this polysilicon that goes into solar panels has origins in Xinjiang. Is this a concern of the European Union? Is there anything that you can do about it?
Well, there's 2 questions. Is it a concern? Absolutely. Is there something we can do about it? I think we can if we act with our partners and allies globally. And I think this always has to be a subject in our discussions with China. It has to be clear that the values we hold dear for ourselves and for Europeans are also part of how we want to negotiate with outside partners. And of course, this is not always easy. Of course, this is tough. Hey, I started in diplomacy during the Cold War, so I know everything about tough negotiations. But one thing I know for sure. If you're not clear about this, if you're weak about this, nobody will respect you. Nobody in China, nobody elsewhere. If you believe in your values, and if you don't want your own citizens to lose their belief in your values, you have to also project those values in your international relations. And of course, this will lead to tensions with China, but that's part of where we are internationally. The good news is that the United States, China, the European Union, and all other major players are all committed now to finding solutions in multilateral negotiations. The US coming back to multilateralism is a game changer, and it will help us convince China to improve the human rights situation. Although, you have to be brutally honest about the fact that it's a world power, and you can't just push a button and make them change.